you talk about the energy security, you talk about having all of the mixes on the table, LNGs, locally supplied fossil fuel sources, piped gas from Moffat, etc. So you want all of these mixes on the table to be available to Gas Networks Ireland, and at the same time you recognise the science that says 80% of known fossil fuels must remain in the ground. And I think the point the Deputy is making about IBEX submission was that LNGs are more dangerous in terms of the emissions and much more expensive. But you still want all of these on the table and are telling us that you accept the science. It really doesn't add up if you are to make a contribution to bringing down our emissions and keeping this country in line with the agreement we made at Paris.
Okay, so I suppose what we're dealing with is the reality that Ireland is going to need a natural gas supply for the foreseeable future, out to 2050 and beyond, by all the research that I've seen. And in order to do that in the most secure way possible, to ensure that we maintain the level of security of supply that we've had previously, we would argue that we should have more than one supply source or one supply point. And of LNG, I accept the 80% just as a matter of point, but it's kind of a practical argument. The more sources of gas that we have coming to the network, the more we can be secure, or we can be confident in making the supply of gas to our customers secure. And if this bill were to be passed, once the Corrib field is depleted, we would be 100% dependent on the interconnector, and we would argue that that's not the most secure way to be dependent on the interconnector solely for our gas supply.
Just to remind you that we heard the evidence from Mr. Paul Allen here earlier on that the continued reliance on gas competes with the renewable industry and pushes the renewable industry back. So how do we rely on gas and at the same time promote renewables in a realistic way that is going to challenge the accord that we have to meet with Paris?
I don't necessarily agree with that point. If you look at the...
You're talking about 40 years' time.
And indeed out to 2050. If you look at the broad range of research that has been done, I haven't seen, and maybe there is something out there, but I haven't seen credible research that would suggest that we will be fossil fuel free or have completely go away from our dependence on natural gas by that time.
What you have seen, and you've acknowledged it, is that we are hurtling towards an overheating of the plant. You've accepted the science around climate change. You acknowledge that and you know that that's the case. So why would you not support a bill that says leave it in the ground? It's simple. We don't have to rely on other supplies of gas right up until 2050. We have Corrib, and then we're importing at the same time, and that gas has already been extracted from the earth.
Well, again, I think there's varying views on that. The International Energy Agency would suggest that we need more exploration and more sites, but it's back to the fundamental. Put forward several measures that we believe will actually significantly assist in that, and in terms of continuing to use gas for power generation, we strongly believe that CCS in the Kinsale gas field is something that absolutely needs to be driven forward and explored, because at the moment nobody can put a credible alternative on the table to say you can shut off the gas power generation.
Nobody is saying you shut off the gas power generation tomorrow. We're saying you have to transit from where we are into almost fully usable renewables. And we've heard lots of arguments around that today. But you quote the International Energy Agency quite a lot. And they said to us here 2 weeks ago that we have a 50-50 chance of meeting our Paris targets. And I put it to you that you wouldn't take a 50% chance of getting on a plane if you were told it's going to crash or it has a 50% chance of crashing. You wouldn't get on that plane, and neither would I. But this is what we're doing with our environment and with our planet, and particularly by arguing that we're going to lock ourselves into a gas-fuelled, carbon-fuelled economy by allowing the further extraction and exploration for oil and gas off Ireland.
I agree with you. I wouldn't get on a plane with a 50% chance, but I think that's the challenge that we have. I don't see
And the other witnesses to answer the questions, and you might just address your questions to whoever.
Thanks very much. Just first of all to Mr. Matt Collins from the department. You said there a few minutes ago that we have to keep all available options on the table. And I really want to question that, because if one of the available options is not going to help us meet our Paris targets, i.e. the extraction of fossil fuels, and if one of those available options is recognised by the science, now unless you refute the science, is widely recognised by the science that 80% of known fossil fuels must stay in the ground, why would we fly in the face of that scientific knowledge and look to extract more? I mean, the bill is quite simple, even though you know, when you discuss out the detail, it might sound like it's creating a lot of complications. But what it is bringing out is, with evidence, for example, from Paul Allen here beside me, is that it is possible to keep the lights on without fossil fuels in the future. And really what we're trying to do here is to say to everybody involved that we need to start now. We need to take decisive action now, rather than seeing this as something way down the line that we can move to. And obviously, I'm not here to argue that the lights must go out and all activity must stop, because you have admitted that we have the energy from Corrib to rely on for up until at least 2030. But we then also, if we are to extract more fossil fuels, will be locking ourselves into a fossil fuelled future for another 20, 30, 40 years beyond that. Because as we discussed last week, it takes that long from the time you issue the licence to extract it and bring it into use. So I'd just like you to comment on that. I'd like to ask Mr. Sheeran from the SEIA, how does he understand that a lot of us are surprised that you're here today in opposition to this bill, given the brief of the SEIA is to be the authority for sustainable energy in Ireland, and that fossil fuel extraction is not sustainable? And again, I assume you accept the science that we have to keep 80% at minimum in the ground, and therefore shouldn't be looking to extract more. But I would like to pointedly ask you if your board has discussed this bill, and if all of the board members have agreed with you that the position you're taking today, that you don't support the bill, is in line with the ethos that the SEIA was set up to establish. I also want to ask you that you accept, I'm not sure, just clarify for me, do you accept that gas is a continuity of using fossil fuels, and it's not clean, it's not fully clean, and it's not a bridging fuel? Because I'm not clear from what you said that you seem to really accept that. And my final questions are for the Gas Networks Ireland. I think that to argue that our supplies are insecure because of Brexit or because of reliance on Russian gas or anything else is completely scaremongering, and this was an argument we had from the International Energy Agency as well. But they use their figures to justify the technology that the extraction and storage of carbon was the solution, and they talked about a 50-50 chance of reaching Paris with that sort of technology. But as we've heard today, that sort of technology isn't possible yet. So we're relying on something into the future rather than something that we can decisively say will be an alternative now. And would you accept that if we find gas in the morning, we're still locking ourselves into a carbon future, because it takes 20, 30, maybe 40 years for that to become usable in this country, but also that we don't necessarily benefit from it in this country. We have supplies from Corrib, but the way the gas regime is structured in this state, there is no obligation on these companies to sell it back to the Irish state. And by the way, they would be selling it back, a natural resource that belongs to the Irish people, at market prices. But there's no obligation under the current regime for gas to be sold back to the Irish state. So if you could just address those, please.
I might start.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that the department are trying to make a case against the bill that it denies us of energy security in the country, that it doesn't contribute to the reduction of emissions, and that it does nothing to incentivise renewables. And I really want to strongly reject that on all three grounds. First of all, there is nothing secure, either energy-wise or any other which way, in a planet that will overheat by more than 2 degrees temperature and will fail to deliver on Paris. Absolutely nothing secure. And I think we've been witnessing that in the last few weeks in places like Quebec and Siberia, where temperatures have been the highest ever on record. People have died. In Cyprus at the moment, old people are dying because of overheating. Now, one can make the argument that that's not evidence of climate change itself, but we have just heard how everybody here accepts the science and the warnings that we need to keep fossil fuels at an absolute minimum. And the main argument we want to make here is that this planet doesn't recognise borders when it comes to climate change. Emissions coming from China or Britain or Ireland or America impact on climate change, and we have to do our bit to ensure that what's required for the future is done, and that is leaving fossil fuels in the ground. And I don't accept that that will not incentivise the renewables energy industry. I believe it will, and I accept the evidence from Mr. Allen here that it actually does incentivise renewables to undermine the production and the pushing of gas. And gas is pushed very much on the Irish community. It's advertised very heavily, and it's advertised as a very green form of energy. You know, the use of blue and green imagery on TV ads, etc. And again, I accept that it is less harmful than coal and oil, but it is not a clean fossil fuel. It does have methane leakage, and it does have its contribution to the overall impact on climate change. And this bill sets out to say to all of the machines in this country, whether it's the employers, the industry or the government and beyond, that we need to do something decisively and do it now, and stop waiting to rely on future technologies to deal with the problem of global warming. We need to begin to deal with it now. In Ireland, like it has been on many other issues, same-sex marriage and other issues, Ireland could be a leader instead of a laggard, as the Taoiseach said. And I really do appeal to the Department, to the Taoiseach and to all the parties to think about that very, very hard and long, because we're running out of time. You cannot deny that what nature is telling us, what the physics is telling us, and we don't have a second chance. We don't get a second bite of the cherry.
Thank you very much, Deputy. And on behalf of the committee,